The Minnesota Court of Appeals on Monday reversed a decision by state regulators to issue the PolyMet Mining Corporation a water quality permit for what would be the state's first copper nickel mine. Now goes back to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to determine whether any pollution discharges from the mine into groundwater would violate the Federal Clean Water Act. Paula Maccabee is the Advocacy Director and Counsel for WaterLegacy. She joins us now for more on this. Paula, welcome back to WTIP.
Thank you, Joe. Lovely to be here.
Wanted to, before we get into the specifics from what happened on January 24th in this ruling from the Minnesota Court of Appeals, Paula, we have now shared a series of updates about some of the permits for PolyMet and the proposed mine, dating back to 2021 in April. Did a big story about the permit to mine that the Minnesota Court of Appeals reversed the DNR's decision to grant PolyMet that critical permit to mine. That was huge news in the spring, last April. And then in December 2021, so just last month, there was news that came out about the air quality permit, and PolyMet in particular, their CEO, John Cherry, and others really celebrating that news, that this air quality permit for the proposed mine was essentially okay, from just a very brief summary of what those stories we've been following are. Now there's this new news that came out. As somebody who follows this story very closely, and our news department at WTIP can kind of follow these patterns and these updates and understand what they mean, and I'm sure obviously you do as well, Paula, but for the average WTIP listener, people just tuning in, we keep hearing these updates. It's a great day for the environmentalists, people concerned about PolyMet. The next day they might hear, or the next month hear, PolyMet gets this great thing that happened for them. So this back and forth, it might be confusing to our listeners. Paula, is there a way we can summarize or explain what this back and forth means?
Sure, Joe, because I think it is important that people realize the context. WaterLegacy started working on this issue in 2009. And in 2009, what people throughout northeastern Minnesota told us is, careful what you're doing. This project is inevitable. There is nothing you can do to stop it. And that was not an unreasonable assumption, because the deck is really stacked against the public interest, against the tribes, against the environmentalists, and against citizens who want to preserve nature and water quality in their way of life. There is an enormous amount of power and money on the side of the mining companies. And in the case of PolyMet, its parent corporation is a mega corporation, international, more than 200 billion with a B assets a year. So this is not an unreasonable position. So in that context, the fact that we are now in January of 2022 and PolyMet has not stuck a shovel in the ground yet, and there is no foreseeable date at which they will do so, is an enormous victory. And that's the context I want people to understand. And now I'm just going to walk a little bit through the different permits. Mm-hmm. The two biggest permits for the state of Minnesota are the permit to mine, which is issued by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, or DNR as we usually call it, and the water pollution permit, which is issued by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, or the PCA, which is how we usually call it. Those two permits have both been reversed. They were issued in 2018, and the courts have said that both of them failed to meet legal requirements. In the case of the permit to mine, PolyMet had offered a proposal to reduce acid mine drainage by the use of bentonite clay, and the Supreme Court looked at it and said that proposal, that scheme for bentonite, there's no substantial evidence to show it's going to work. And so that was sent back for a contested case. In addition, the Minnesota Supreme Court back in April said there's no limit, there's no term limit on the PolyMet permit to mine, and Minnesota law requires a term limit. So right now, the DNR is preparing for a contested case hearing in which WaterLegacy and our allies will participate on whether bentonite is going to work. And I have to tell you, we've talked to a number of experts, and they laugh. They say, that bentonite plant is not likely to work. It has not been current or prudent engineering or environmental practice for decades, if ever, and that there are other ways that even people who are pro-mining say PolyMet is no good. So this is where we're at with a permit to mine. We're going to have a contested case hearing, and then the DNR has to decide whether or not to reissue the permit, and if so, does PolyMet have to change? Do they have to change their design and go back and do a new or revised application? Now, what happened yesterday, the Minnesota Court of Appeals issued what I consider to be a relatively crafty opinion. What they basically said is, we've already had a Minnesota Supreme Court case, and this was last year. It was WaterLegacy's case and a case with the Fond du Lac Band, where the Minnesota Supreme Court case reversed the permit when the Pollution Control Agency basically failed to consider that contaminated seepage through groundwater would surface in wetlands and streams and violate water quality standards. So the Court of Appeals said, we already know that has to happen, and the Pollution Control Agency didn't do that. So the permit has gone back. It's been reversed. So right now, PolyMet doesn't have a permit to mine, and they don't have a water pollution permit. Those are the two most important state permits. Now, if I can just go one step further, the most important federal permit is called the Section 404. It's also a Clean Water Act permit, but it basically lets the mining company destroy wetlands. And that permit is now suspended, which means it's on hold because the Fond du Lac Band has made a determination under specific federal law that gives tribes the right to ensure that their own reservation water quality standards are protected. The tribe has made a determination that the PolyMet project will result in violation of tribal water quality standards. And that, in order to resolve that issue, the Army Corps of Engineers at the federal level has to hold a hearing. So, yes, there are some permits that have just gone through the process, and the air quality permit is one that has. But the two most important state permits, permit to mine and water quality permit, they've been reversed. There isn't a permit right now. And the really important federal permit, which is the wetlands destruction or Section 404 permit, is on hold. It's suspended until a hearing process takes place to make sure that the PolyMet project will not increase toxic mercury on the Fond du Lac Reservation. So that's where we are today in sort of the big picture. And I think that PolyMet, they have an amazing PR machine, and I don't want to diminish that. And the MPCA and the DNR, they're gung-ho about this project, no matter how cruddy it is. But there have been some very significant victories in holding off and reversing these permits.
So, Paula, thank you for that explanation of the different permits. And I think even with that, just in the context that when people hear news, hear something about PolyMet and a permit being reversed or changed, that just speaking overview again, now here in January 2022, where are you and WaterLegacy and the bands and others who are concerned about this project? Is it in a good position that this project won't happen, or where are you at on where things stand?
Well, where we're at on where things stand is that we cannot take anything for granted. I mean, we are going to have to do everything possible in the contested case hearing to demonstrate that the permit to mine should not be reissued and that PolyMet's proposal is substandard. It's bargain basement, low-quality project that should not be allowed in Minnesota. Similarly, we're going to have to work with the agency process to show that PolyMet is actually, its current proposal would violate the Clean Water Act, and that untreated, contaminated seepage, both at the mine and at the tailings basin, would result in violations of water quality. So what I think people need to realize is that reversing the permits doesn't mean that our work is over. it means that our work needs to gear up once again to continue to oppose not only sulfide mining in general, but the PolyMet project, which is a cheap, low-grade, and extremely risky project in a watershed that has an enormous value, not just to us as Minnesotans and to the tribes, but for the preservation of Lake Superior, one of the world's most important sources of fresh water.
And so it doesn't mean, in other words, that the project can't eventually move forward, win approval from the courts and the regulators at the state level and so forth. But without this water quality permit, there's certainly not going to be anything happening in the near term as far as getting the project built and moving forward.
I think that's a really good way to put it, Joe. Our work behind the scenes, and I say our, I mean WaterLegacy, our environmental allies, the tribes, our work doesn't stop. But if we're looking at situations like Line 3, where there were never any permits reversed and never any permits suspended, the destruction just went on despite the litigation. And what our victories have meant in the PolyMet case is not that we can sit back and say, oh, it's never going to happen, but we can say until all of the legal and factual issues are resolved, they can't destroy the wetlands, they cannot contaminate the surface water, they cannot increase the mercury contamination of fish. So that while we are doing all this legal work and experts and scientists, the environment, the nature is not being harmed.
Okay. Well, what happened on January 24th was a Minnesota Court of Appeals reversed a decision by state regulators to issue PolyMet a water quality permit for what would be the state's first copper nickel mine. Now goes back to the MBCA to determine whether any pollution discharges from the mine into groundwater would violate the Federal Clean Water Act. Today we've been speaking with Paula Maccabee, the Advocacy Director and Counsel for WaterLegacy. Thank you, as always, for your time, Paula.
Really appreciate it, Joe, and thanks a lot.